given that, do you think there is a responsibility with associations to safeguard their members? Is there any liability involved that maybe associations have or haven't thought about at this point? Are there other sort of factors that are going to come into play that we might not have realized? I know you're not legal professionals, but does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for associations because, you know, often you see when one new piece of advice or legislation comes out, you always see things cropping up of other sectors saying, well, how does that apply to us? And so those questions are going to come up for associations and bands and individuals. What I would say, and I suppose, you know, everyone's got their own responsibility in word fighting this. Obviously, on an individual level, we need to be sensible. And obviously, bands shouldn't be organising practices when they know they shouldn't be. As to whether there's liability, I mean, it's, you know, I know in Scotland we obviously have, they've now introduced fines, and that's into legislation. And certainly in the news here, you hear of, you know, venues being fined quite heavily for, you know, sometimes quite blatant disregard of the current guidelines. So in theory, there could be financial penalties, but certainly a lot of these, some of the areas, it's quite unclear, and particularly as things evolve and change, a lot of sectors, and including piping and drumming, sort of wonder where we fall into that. So it's quite difficult, yes.
Yeah.
Welcome to America, right?
Sorry, Jim.
Everything is liability. I was saying, welcome to America, right? Everything is liability in America. I mean, somebody will find a reason to sue you for anything. So I completely agree with what Dr. Dick just said. Yeah,
I was just going to ask you, Jim, and Martin, you know, because it is the United States in a much more litigious sort of environment, perhaps you've already thought about some of those issues, you know, when it comes to pipe bands and associations and a liability factor.
Were I an organizer, I would not want to take that on right now. I would not want to be the test case.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, you know, if it were up to you, what are some of the things that you would want to put in place? Would you follow guidelines set out by government when it comes to, you know, hobbyist groups like piping and drumming?
I would think so. I mean, it may even go so far as to, you know, send your proof of vaccination before you can join the association or before you can register for a particular competition, you know, or having the pipe major of the band or something sign a letter saying that everybody meets the criteria to be able to be in social contact, at least for the next year or 2 years or 3 years until this kind of simmers down a little bit. I could see any one of those sorts of restrictions being put in place.
Yeah, it sounds, you know, that kind of a scenario would be really complicated, but, you know, it could be reality. Martin, any thoughts around that?
Can I just come in for a second there, Andrew?
Yeah.
Just following on from what Lachie said and from Jim, I think liability is one word here, but I think responsibility is the main word that we should be focusing on. And, you know, everybody that's involved in anything in life at the moment has to be responsible for their actions when it comes to not spreading COVID. And Lachie made a very good point about pipe bands having this wide-reaching sort of aspect into societies. If you think of how much teaching is provided by people in the 60-plus age bracket, many of these people will have things like type 2 diabetes. Some of them might have COPD or other smoking-related illnesses. It's really our responsibility as individuals not to put the more vulnerable people in society at risk. So there's only so much the government and sort of organisations can do to get that message across. But I think we need to be guided not by pipe bands being special in some way, but by being members of a society that have got a responsibility. And that's the price we pay for living in democratic communities, is we have to have some responsibility for our own actions, and we have to agree to, you know, be led by the government on making these decisions. Sometimes they might be wrong, sometimes they might be right, but responsibility comes down to us ultimately to make sure we're keeping ourselves safe, our families safe, and everyone we interact with.
Yeah, really important points, Robert. And fortunately, you know, fortunately, pipers and drummers, it is kind of look out for one another. I would say 99% of pipers and drummers think that way. There's always that 1%, that we have to look out for, particularly, in a situation where, it is a hobby and people like to socialize and have a drink and let their guard down a little bit. Martin, you were going to chime in, I think, with some thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, I agree with the responsibility part, but I think certainly in North America with the liability laws, I don't see a way that a pipe band or a large competing pipe band can get away with not pretty much requiring vaccination for members. You'd be laying yourself wide open for liability. So, as pipe bands sometimes are democratic, sometimes the pipe major is in charge of everything. I think the days of that's pretty much gone by now, but I think bands as a whole are going to have to get together and decide these are the rules that we want to adopt. If you want to play with us, compete with us, you're going to have to be vaccinated and take it from there.
Or is there, I know we're getting into kind of legal side of things, but, signing a waiver or something that perhaps could be possible as well.
Well, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I would hate to get into the waiver side of it, but it would be difficult, I think, for 95% of the band to be vaccinated and 5% to decide not to, and be that irresponsible. I hopefully that wouldn't happen, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, well, optimistically thinking, it is a very close-knit community, and I think everybody, pipers and drummers, look out for one another as much as possible. So let's hope that that holds true going forward and doing the right things. Given all what we've talked about now and what and understanding, of course, that it's a moving target and things are fluid, the 2021 summer in the Northern Hemisphere anyway, is it realistic to think that we're going to be able to get back, pipe bands especially, are going to be able to get back in-person competitions? Jim, maybe start with you.
I think locally people will do it. I think the bands in Scotland will play in Scotland, and maybe Northern Ireland will travel over to Scotland the way they always have before. But I think it's going to be really hard for especially the multitude of lower grade bands, and I include my teaching program in Connecticut in that group. It's going to be really hard for them to get their act together with respect to fundraising and organizing and travel and finding a place to stay and that sort of thing and get over there for 2021. I don't see that being feasible, but possibly towards the end of the summer, we may be able to find a local contest here or there, or, a gig or something like that to get out and play at. I don't see it happening much before that.
Lachie, thinking along the same lines?
Perhaps a little bit more pessimistic. I think, given the numbers of people involved, we're really just getting started with the vaccination in Scotland and the UK. Although it's not quite as pertinent as North American bands, we still do have a travel aspect. And at the moment, I can't leave Edinburgh. I can for work, and I do, but it's illegal for me to travel to certain areas because they're in a lower tier than we are here. So I just find it really hard to anticipate a path where in the next 5-6 months we'll all of a sudden get back to almost normality. I suppose the other thing to consider as well, and watching some of your other sort of interviews, it's been quite a lot of people quite open that they've not picked up the pipes since March, and I think our band's going to be ready for a competing season and play at a level that they would be happy with. I think I know what Jim was saying about maybe later on in the summer. Maybe if the vaccination program goes very well, it might be possible. I certainly see more prospects of maybe in the solo scene. Traditionally, there's smaller numbers involved. It's probably easier to do social distancing, but I struggle to see a pipe band season at the moment. But I hope I'm wrong. But I think it's been very challenging. I think either way.
Robert, Martin, any thoughts along those lines?
I was thinking that optimistically the Worlds might be a go. I agree that the quality of playing might not be what it has been in the past just because of the difficulty of practicing. But in August, it's possible, again, optimistically and depending on vaccine levels and how the virus actually reacts and whether the numbers fall, either by vaccination or other causes. If we have significantly falling numbers, it's possible that the Worlds might be a go. That's what I'm hoping for.
That would be good. Robert?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would be thinking along the lines of Lachie. I'd be a bit pessimistic that things will be anyway back to normal. And I think it's important to also focus on what's really important here for the piping movement in general and pipe bands. And, you know, it's great to think that you might have a Grade 1 World Championships, but is that really the most important thing? I think it's probably more important that, you know, we know that kids on the whole can carry COVID and be asymptomatic or certainly not get severe illness. And I just wonder if our focus for competing should be the first major goal should be getting kids bands back to competing in some way in Scotland, you know, even if that's in reduced numbers with social distancing or some very creative ways of doing that, because they're the future. You know, there will be some guys in Grade 1 bands who've maybe, or any grades who've maybe got one last season left in them and they might miss out. But if we don't get the kids hooked now, then, you know, we've got many seasons where they will not, you know, benefit from everything we've benefited from. So I think we should be focusing on not getting too sort of concerned about not having all the major championships this year, but trying to be creative about it. But that's obviously up to the associations who run these things and up to the individual bands. But, you know, you've got to look at it from your own perspective as well. Would you want to, at this moment in time, go to a gathering of, you know, several thousand people when COVID is raging? No, you wouldn't, I assume. Would you want to do that in the summer when if there's still a high chance you would get the infection? And, you know, I don't think I would if that was the case. So, you know, moving target, but I think we need to manage expectations and think, right, is the target getting kids bands back and then thinking about getting things up and running for 2022? It's not what everyone wants to hear, but generally, you know, there's nothing about this virus that people want to hear. So, you know, because it's been so
wrong. I feel like if we do this wrong and we get people who get really sick going to sort of super spreader events because we held them too early, it's only going to impact what happens in 22 and 23 and 24.
Yeah.
And maybe the better part about it is, like Robert says, to say, you know, maybe we hold off on 21. I think a lot of bands will probably make that decision independently too, to say, I know I'm not taking my kids over this year.
Yeah, and you know, there is the idea that bands need some time to get back up to standard, and maybe that will just take time, you know, especially at the higher grades, and you know, not showing their cards early. Look, guys, you know, the best policy is always reality and telling the truth, and you guys have been very truthful and frank. Varying opinions, to be sure, but you know, it's important, you know, that we do, you know, talk about things in realistic terms, and really appreciate, you know, Dr. Jim Feeney, Dr. Robert Gray, Dr. Lachie Dick, and Dr. Martin Docherty, all accomplished physicians and all very accomplished pipers. You come at this with a very unique perspective, and really appreciate the honesty and the reality that you've provided to us today. Thanks again.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.